So
So
yeah.
you and I have very similar leadership styles in the sense that we love being down in the weeds. We have very strong opinions. Well, I'll speak for myself. I have very strong opinions, and sometimes I have a very hard time not sharing those opinions, which is why we started a podcast.
Welcome to the Leadr Pulse podcast, the podcast with actionable insights for leaders revolutionizing the world of work. I'm Holly Tate, Chief Marketing Officer here at Leadr and your co-host for the Leadr Pulse podcast. On today's episode, Matt Tresidder and Mark Kosoglow get to dive into this concept of micromanagement. Mark was the SVP of Global Sales at a company called Outreach that is one of the most successful tech and SaaS companies. So they dive into the question of micromanagement versus macromanagement, and they discuss if micromanagement is really a good thing. Then you get to hear Matt and I debate this topic. So tune in for some hot takes today on micromanagement versus freedom. Here's Matt and Mark.
Okay, well, hey, Mark. So nice to meet you today. Get some time together.
Let's go, brother.
I had a motto for a long time. It was called "Refuse to be the bottleneck." And I recently got some feedback from someone that said that that was a silly motto. And especially as an executive, they said you should choose when to be the bottleneck. So instead of saying you're always going to slow down, you're never going to let anything slow down. They said choose when to slow other people down. In other words, choose when to be the bottleneck for excellence. Don't let everything just go through and let it be fast. Choose when to be the bottleneck. However, I've learned that as I start to be the bottleneck, in other words, go down in details, people have described me as a micromanager. And I've heard you have kind of a hot take around this potentially, that being a micromanager or being interpreted as a micromanager is not always a bad thing. So I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, I think that there's just some functions inside of a job that warrant micromanagement. And, for me, I'm going to use my area of expertise, which is sales. And there are probably 1% to 5% of sellers that will prospect without micromanagement. The other 99 to 95% will not.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter how you incentivize them, doesn't matter how you compensate them, it doesn't matter what resources you give them, doesn't matter what training you give them, doesn't matter how automated you make it. They just don't think that that's their job anymore, or they don't like it so much, or they use excuses not to do it, whatever. And at Outreach, we went for a long time. All of our pipeline was sourced outbound. Then we brought in marketing. Marketing caused us to explode. Then we reached another part where we needed to explode. So we reintroduced AE prospecting. And my AEs at this point hadn't prospected for probably 5 years at Outreach. And when we did that, our first attempt failed. Our second attempt failed. Another third attempt, we became micromanaging assholes and it blew up.
Got it.
And so I have one of my right-hand guys at Outreach is named Nate Broom, and he was a former SDR leader turned into a sales leader. And he brought the rigor that we needed in prospecting. And we started to say, listen, there's a spectrum for everything that we ask people to do. There's micromanagement, and then there's complete freedom and autonomy. And every project that we release, we have to determine where we're going to put it on this spectrum in order to get the right level of execution. And some things have to be all on the micromanagement side.
Micromanagement Assholes feels like a great book. I feel like you've got to write that.
Or at least this episode or something, right?
Yeah, gotta be, right? Okay, so tell me when you know it needs to fall on that spectrum of micromanagement. Is it the level of suck of the job, of the role and responsibility? Is that when you're like, okay, prospecting sucks, that requires micromanagement? What's your level? How do you measure it?
I think that that's one axis. Another one might be like how important it is. Like, for example, let's say that we're putting in $250,000 into Dreamforce. We have a booth, we're sending people, we're doing lead stuff. And I've asked my reps, I need you to invite 20 people from your territory to this event. Now, I can just tell them everything we've done and hope that they do it. But we know like less than a quarter of your reps are going to respond to that email. Right. What it takes is I will send you a list on Monday. On Monday, I need every rep to say they got the list. On Tuesday, I expect at least 5 people to be on the list. If you don't get on the list, we'll send you a personal Slack and talk to you about what you need to do to get started. By Wednesday, I need 10. By Friday, I need 20. And this is how we're going to do it. It's how everybody's going to do it. If you don't do it, your manager's going to call you and do it with you. And so, but that's a perfect example. Like boring, it has, it's urgent, it's important, not urgent. I don't really
Right.
need to do this, but I know that it's going to help me in the long run. This is more
Yeah.
important. And so you just have to, micromanagement can relieve some of the decision-making stress on someone. If I'm being told exactly what to do, how to do it, when to do it, then that's a lot of stuff I don't have to figure out on my own.
But would the response to that be, if you're the direct report being on the receiving end of that, would they say, you don't trust me, you don't value me, I don't have a voice here, I don't get the responsibility to step up and make my own decisions, and that's okay?
And my response is, the last 3 times I've asked you to do this, you haven't done it for me. So therefore, we have switched into micromanagement mode. Like, we have to remember, most salespeople's comp is 2 components: a base salary and commissions. Commissions are based on your skill, your expertise, and all this stuff, and how well you perform. And the base salary buys me an amount of your time to do whatever I ask you to do in that amount of time that's within the scope of the job.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
we've lost this. I'm paying a mid-market rep $80,000 to $100,000. Guess what I've bought? I've bought the right for them to do prospecting. I've bought them to get me back an event list in a week. I've bought them to do cold calls every day. I'm buying that with your base salary. Now, if you don't want to do that stuff, then we need to renegotiate your base salary, because that's what I'm paying for. Everything that does and sets up, now that on your own, like, your commissions take care, and the better rep you are, the more money you make. But like, I get to dictate some stuff because I'm giving you a base salary.
Makes sense. Okay, so 2 follow-up questions. One, you said, hey, this is the 3rd time, so now we're micromanaging. Does that mean they can earn the macromanaging back after they've proven functioning under micromanaging for a season, maybe?
I think that there's some things that need to have an org-wide energy or vibe to them, like prospecting in general. There's no opting out of it, right? Like, you need to do it this way. Everybody does it. We're all going to suffer together. And if you have a better way, you can do your better way, but you still need to do some of our way, right? And everybody's got an oar, so everybody's got a row. You don't, just because you have a motorboat doesn't mean you get to jump out of the ship and jump in your motorboat, right?
Right.
So, but some other stuff isn't quite as demanding, and so you can earn the right back.
Okay. And then second question, you said, I think you said you get freedom for a lot of other things. Is that the word you use? So it's micromanagement on one end, and then you get the freedom to choose on the other.
Complete freedom on the other side. Do whatever you want.
And so I think the message behind the message is, you can't just have a culture of micromanagement. You have to have the seesaw. You've got to even that out. Okay. It's a very powerful tool when used correctly, a powerful tool for good. It's a powerful tool for evil when used incorrectly. I see, if you talk to the hundreds of reps that have worked with me, that they would say, in general, Mark's culture is fun. It's very safe to talk about risk. You're going to expect it to be work hard and held accountable, but you're going to learn a ton, and it's going to be really positive, and you're never going to, I just had somebody the other day, like, Mark, every time I came to you, I never had to worry what mark I was going to get. Was I going to get end of the quarter stress mark, beginning of the quarter happy mark, middle of the quarter worried mark? Just consistent mark.
The same person every day. So that allows me, then that gives me room then to be sometimes super free and then sometimes super micromanaging. Because we'd always explain why we're doing what we're doing, because we made a conscious decision on that spectrum of how micromanaging or how free we wanted to be.
We have a lot of first-time manager listeners, and I can hear some of them thinking in their heads, micromanagement was always taught to me as a bad word. How do I maybe make the jump to be a little bit more in that direction? Do you have any practical advice for them?
Yeah, so you definitely can't tell your reps you're going to micromanage them. That's got too much, that word is laced with too much meaning, right? What I would say is, we have a structured process we need you to follow, right? And so sometimes that structured process might include 1 or 2 steps. Sometimes it might include 20 steps. And the more steps and the more direction, the more micromanagey I would consider it, right?
Good. I love that.
Okay, Matt, I loved listening to this episode with you and Mark about what maybe we should just call the title of this episode, Micromanaging Assholes. You suggested that you guys should write a book on it. Because you seem to really agree with Mark on this topic of micromanaging, which is pretty spicy. So to me, when I listened to it, it sounded like you agreed with Mark. Is that true?
I do. I don't know where the line quite is yet on which which aspects require or should be micromanaged, but I do believe there's a place in the workplace for it. But the distinction of when that happens, that's the hard part, I think. But I do agree with them. I agree with the concept, which is a very spicy take.
Well, and it's especially spicy for you because right behind your shoulder there is your book that's called Management is Dead.
It doesn't say micromanagement is dead, though.
Okay, well, let's unpack that. What's the difference between management being dead and micromanagement not being dead? Because, I mean, that sounds like semantics to me.
Yeah, that does a lot of semantics. I think the point he was making, which I agree with, is there are some things that are too important to be delegated. At the end of the day, and what I referenced in the episode was a quote that Frank Blake and I, the ex-CEO of Home Depot, discussed, which is, as the leader, sometimes you actually have to choose to be the bottleneck because your standards for excellence are so high. And that can be perceived as micromanagement, which is the number one complaint that people have about their leaders, right? The number one complaint we always hear is that that person's a micromanager. And so it's awful on the receiving end. I'm sure you and I both had stories of when we were micromanaged and we hated it. But I guess the point that Mark was saying, and let's unpack it, is there are some things where the stakes are too high, the standards are not actually currently high enough, and they have to be raised, that the leader has to jump in and raise the bar of excellence. And that's not going to feel great on the receiving end, but it has to happen to move the team forward.
Yeah.
Should it? Let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it. So I disagree with you and Mark in the sense that the example that you guys were unpacking together, I can't remember what the exact KPI was for him, but it was something on the sales team with like,
I think he said
prospecting. It's prospecting.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was like, every AE will always not do it unless you micromanage it. And where I go to as the leader, my experience as a leader so far, when I have had to micromanage, it is either one of two things in my experience. One, it's the wrong person for the job. So there is a disconnect between either the skills or the competency of the person and what I've asked of them or what the job description is demanding of them. Or if they are the right person for the job and I'm finding myself micromanaging, it's because I haven't set clear expectations and provided clarity around what or how they should, why it's important, And so to me, if we, especially as executives, are spending our time micromanaging on something to me that sounds as basic as prospecting, then we have a hiring problem or we have a clarity/goal problem as an executive, or maybe we're not effectively tying the why for the employee back to why it is an expectation. And so if we're finding ourselves micromanaging on a regular basis, to me, it's a leadership issue.
I'm easily galvanized. And so now I'm like, I think I agree with Holly, but let me push back for a moment because everything you said is true. It's a failure of leadership. Perhaps it's a failure of hiring. Perhaps it's a failure of setting healthy expectations. But I remember a story there's a book called Ride of a Lifetime. It's written by Bob Iger, who is the previous CEO of Disney. I think he's back right now, actually. I think he came back to the CEO again. He told a story about his predecessor, Michael Eisner, and one of his philosophies was micromanagement is underrated. And he tells the story of when they were launching Disneyland, the park, they were walking through doing sort of the pre-screen before they launched to the public. And he noticed that the walkways weren't quite wide enough. And his point was there needs to be able to have two full families walking in opposite directions fitting on these parkways, or the whole logistics of the park are going to fall apart. So he delayed the launch of Disneyland. I think it was weeks, just so that he could increase the width of the parkway by, I think it was only a foot, maybe a foot and a half. And so I guarantee you every single person in his downlines called him a micromanager. The thing I'm advocating for is, as the CEO, Michael Eisner, it's his prerogative to kind of get down in the weeds and micromanage, quote unquote, to make sure that the standard of excellence is high enough. Now, all of them are going to complain and say he was a micromanaging CEO. But at the end of the day, what was right? That the park launched with the correct logistics, or that it launched poorly and they had to go back and correct it anyway? That's kind of the spicy rejection of your point.
But what if before the project was even started, in the planning, what if he had cast vision for, hey, forget centimeters and inches and what the width exactly should be. But the vision here is that families can have the best experience at Disneyland. And in order to do that, we need to be thinking about how two families can easily walk in opposite directions in any part of our park. Then he wouldn't have had to delay the project by weeks and sacrifice revenue and excitement and frustration from the team. And so to me, I feel like it still goes back to potentially, obviously we weren't there, what do we know? But potentially a lack of vision or a lack of clarity around what success looked like for the project.
But now we're asking leaders to be a crystal ball gazer. Like maybe he didn't know, benefit of the doubt, maybe he didn't know it and see it until he was actually walking in a park, seeing the crowds walking through and being like, wait a second, this doesn't work. And now we're placing, like, in hindsight, the expectations that he should have foreseen every single extenuating circumstance when they were in the architecture phase. Like, are we really placing that amount of expectations that the visionary, the leader, is supposed to see every single scenario ahead of time? I mean, I don't know. That seems a little unrealistic.
Yeah, I do think that's impossible for leaders to see every scenario, but I do think it's a good reminder for us to, because what I'm thinking about is if excellence is a value, or, let's say maybe family experience, I don't know, I'm just making this up, but like maybe family experience is a value of Disney World or Disneyland or the Disney company. If we are drilling back to our values as an organization in everything we do and effectively infusing that down the organization, it feels like a project manager or a designer or whoever lower down on the org chart should have thought of that before he did. And so that's my argument for where, it goes back to a leadership issue of maybe we wouldn't have to micromanage prospecting or how big a sidewalk is, or even myself, like, well, here's a practical example. We just did where I found myself having to micromanage is what I'm saying. And what I think I could have done better to not micromanage that project. So we just did some promo videos for a couple of things. And I, I've got a lot going on. And so I was like, hey, I want to have minimal meetings about this on the front end. Like, I really want to just trust this team to create these videos. And I don't really want to be in the details of it. And so I put together, like, we had a couple of meetings beforehand, but I found myself having to micromanage some details that were in the video. Whereas if I had clearly stated that on the front end of like, hey, even like tiny things, which is micromanagement, like our brand colors for text in the video. If I had been clear about like the brand components, I wouldn't have had to be that down in the weeds of sending those corrections afterwards. So that's like a really micro example of micromanagement. But I do think I would have avoided some of that micromanagement if I had spent more time on the front end, setting clear expectations for the team that was working on that project.
So that's a really good example, actually. So let me ask you this. If we had set micro expectations on the front end of the project, well, first of all, if you were to set micro expectations, is that perceived as micromanagement if you're on the receiving end of it? So like, let's say you go back to that meeting when you did the project brief. Okay, now, here are the brand colors. Here's the length of the video. Here's how many times I want people talking. Here's what I want. Like, if you were to lay it out that descriptive, are you going to be described as a micromanager anyway?
That's a great question. Probably yes, because in a joking way, because I have a good relationship with the person that was leading it. He was like, oh, Holly, are you being a diva? Which was like we both laughed about it, but I think that was his way of saying you're a micromanager, was calling me a diva. But actually, I think that was in reference to me not wanting to have all of the meetings, because I basically was very candid and direct.
Right.
I don't have time for hours of meetings before that. Like, I think I just said that, was like, I don't have time for hours of meetings. And he was like, oh, Holly, are you being a diva? So that's interesting. It was like, maybe it was me not wanting to be a macro manager and like abdicate the responsibility of the video that on the front end, I don't know. But I probably was seen as a micromanager on the back end by being so detailed about like even the colors of the text in the video.
So you and I have very similar leadership styles in the sense that we love being down in the weeds. We have very strong opinions. Well, I'll speak for myself. I have very strong opinions. And sometimes I have a very hard time not sharing those opinions, which is why we started a podcast. And no, I second guess a lot when I have high standards. I want to be down in the weeds and I see something and I'm like, do I speak up? Or I know I'm just going to be described as a micromanager. And so then it's the way that I navigate the conversation, the way that I introduce it. But I find myself having a really hard time not speaking up because I'm not going to be proud of what we deliver if I don't. That's the tension that I feel. And that's why I want to side with Mark and be like, yeah, I agree. Like we should be excellent in all things. So I'm going to be a driver, even though it might result in me being labeled as a micromanager. That's the tension I feel.
100%. I think the leadership issue or principle that we have to figure out, that I'm constantly thinking about, is how do we develop that perspective though in the next level of leadership below us so that we don't have to be micromanaging. For example, like, and that was kind of where I went back to, like, the architect or the designer, whoever was responsible for those sidewalks.
Right.
Like, how do we as the leaders infuse that level of, whether it's ownership or values or care or strategic thinking, so that they are the ones that are micromanaging it before it gets to our desk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, the leadership gap, that if we just say micromanagement is something that should always be happening, then I'm afraid we're not developing that next level of leaders to be able to run faster than us and catch those things, because they know that we will. Like,
right.
they know,
Right.
oh, Holly's always going to find that typo, so I'm going to give her 60% good enough work. I'm constantly going to be the bottleneck because my team knows I'll catch it. Whereas if I'm like, hey, it's your responsibility to catch, like, we have this value of like real talk at Leadr, like exceptional customer experience. And so if you're sending me something that is not exceptional, then that's not acceptable, right?
And I think that is the difference between, and that's why the book is titled Management is Dead, because that line that you just said is really good leadership. That is, you took ownership for, hey, I could have shared more why or details in the front end. But now let me harken back to the values. You're not living up to our standards by X, Y, and Z. Now that is leadership alive and well, and management is dead in a sense, because you're putting their development and an opportunity for them to learn and grow at the forefront of that conversation, as opposed to being punitive about the task was missed. You've elevated it beyond that little piece. So I really like this conversation, because I think what we're searching for is like a black and white answer. It feels just like attention.
Yep. I think it is. I think the takeaway, at least for me, that I'm taking away from this conversation is, as the leader, it's our responsibility to get clarity about what is most important right now. And so in Mark's example, it was prospecting. Now where we can debate is, what does that look like lived out day to day? Is it him feeling like he's got to babysit the AEs so that they actually get it done? I would argue they're probably not the right person if you have to babysit them. But I think what we all agree on is it's our responsibility as a leader to align on and then communicate clearly what the most important thing is. And
over and over and over and over again, right?
Yeah.
It's that idea of the chief reminding officer, because people will benchmark themselves to the lowest standard because we just resort to what's easiest in the path of least resistance, what's most comfortable. And so I think the point there is, being a chief reminding officer means bringing it up over and over and over and over again. But the how that you do that may be determined whether you're labeled as a micromanager or labeled as a good leader. Maybe that's the difference.
That's the difference. That's the question.
Yep.
Really good conversation, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
If you enjoyed today's episode with Mark, then you've got to follow him on LinkedIn. So check out today's show notes wherever you're listening to this, where we'll post Mark's LinkedIn so you can connect and follow him, where he posts regularly his own hot takes on company growth and leadership. We'll see you next time on the Leadr Pulse podcast.